She thought she was simply doing her duty as a black waitress, rushing home from a double shift, once a nursing student, but life had pulled her back to serving tables. But moments later, the city held its breath as she realized the woman dying in her arms was the untouchable matriarch of the Baek crime syndicate. And in the silence that followed the sirens, the impossible happened. A black waitress saves a dying Korean mafia boss mother, and instead of a handshake, the matriarch looked her son in the eye and publicly names her the future daughter-in-law, freezing the underworld in absolute shock. In the neon shadows of Seoul, Madame Yoon-seok was more than a grandmother. She was the Iron Lotus. She was the spine of the Baek family empire, a woman whose whisper was louder than a gunshot and whose disapproval could exile you from the city. But poison doesn't care about reputation. On a sweltering afternoon, during a ruthless assassination attempt involving a neurotoxin, Madame Yoon's life collided with the one person nobody saw coming, Imani Clark. A weary nursing student in a stained apron, finishing a double shift, dreaming only of a quiet bed and tuition money. When the assassin struck and the crowd scattered in terror, that waitress made a split-second choice. She didn't run away from the danger. She ran toward the pulse. She kept the queen alive. But in doing so, she did more than stop a heart from stopping. She stepped directly into a war of succession, into the crosshairs of a traitor, and into the dark, terrifying orbit of Baek Jin-Seok, a mafia prince who arrived ready to burn the world down, only to find a stranger saving his world instead. Don't go anywhere, because this isn't just a story about a rescue. It's about a clash of cultures, a contract of blood, and how one moment of kindness forced the most dangerous man in Korea to bow to a new kind of queen. 10 minutes before the world turned upside down, Imani Clark was just a black waitress with aching feet, praying the Q train wouldn't be delayed. She was scraping gum off table 4 when the squeal of tires shattered the afternoon lull. Outside the diner's window, a sleek sedan careened into a lamppost, not from a driver's error, but from the precision of a tactical ambush. Imani didn't hide behind the counter like the others. She saw the older woman in the back seat slump forward, not from the impact, but from the seizure seizing her limbs. Imani bolted out the door. By the time she reached the wreckage, the attackers had vanished, leaving only smoke and the groans of the driver. Imani ripped the rear door open. Madame Yoon-seok was dying. Her skin was clammy, pupils pinned, classic signs of a neurotoxin. "Help me get her flat." Imani shouted to no one, dragging the matriarch onto the pavement. She tore open the woman's silk blouse, her fingers flying to find a pulse. It was thready, fading fast. "Stay with me. Come on." She began compressions, her rhythm steady against the chaos. 1, 2, 3. Breathe. The screech of arriving SUVs cut through the panic. Doors flew open, and a phalanx of men in dark suits poured out, weapons drawn. At the center was Baek Jin-Seok. He moved with the terrifying, coiled energy of a Korean mafia boss walking into a slaughter. He raised his handgun, aiming directly at the person hovering over his mother. "Step away," he roared, his voice cracking like a whip. "She's in respiratory arrest." Imani didn't flinch, didn't stop her compressions. She looked up, her eyes fierce with professional defiance. "If I stop, she dies. Do you want to shoot me, or do you want her to live?" Jin-Seok froze. He saw the improvised tourniquet, the rhythm of Imani's hands, the way his mother's pale hand was clutching the waitress's wrist with a death grip. Madame Yoon's eyes fluttered open, locking onto Imani. "Saved." The old woman rasped, her voice weak, but audible in the sudden silence. "My daughter." The air left the street. Jin-Seok lowered his gun, the friction of the moment shifting from violence to confusion. He heard the sirens approaching, police, press, the public eye. If his mother spoke those words publicly, if she named this stranger her future daughter-in-law in front of his enemies, the target on Imani's back would be the size of Seoul. He made a decision. "Get her in the car," Jin-Seok ordered his men, gesturing to his mother. Then he turned his cold gaze to Imani. "You too." "I'm waiting for the ambulance," Imani protested, backing away as the adrenaline crashed. There is no ambulance for us, Jin-Seok said, stepping into her space, his shadow engulfing her. You touched her. You're involved. Get in or die here. Imani woke to the scent of sandalwood and silence, a heavy, expensive silence that felt suffocating. This wasn't her cramped studio with a radiator that hissed all night. This was a sprawling suite of silk sheets and floor-to-ceiling marble. Disorientation hit her first, followed by a sharp spike of adrenaline. She sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs, her eyes landing on a tablet left intentionally on the bedside table. The screen glowed with a news ticker that made her blood run cold. The headline was bold, a digital brand searing her new reality into existence. The Black Waitress who saved the Iron Lotus. But it was the subheadline that froze her lungs. Sources claimed Madame Yoon had not only been saved from dying in the street, but had claimed her savior. The words future daughter-in-law stared back at her, a title that felt less like an honor and more like a target. She scrambled out of the bed, ignoring the plush robe draped over the chair. She needed an exit. She needed air. Bursting through the heavy oak doors, she sprinted down a hallway lined with ancient vases that probably cost more than her tuition, turning a corner only to collide with a chest as solid as granite. Baek Jin-Seok didn't even sway. He stood there, immaculate in a charcoal suit, looking every bit the lethal Korean Mafia boss the city feared. Let me pass, Imani snapped, stepping back, but refusing to shrink. I did my job. I saved her. Now I'm going home. You don't have a home anymore, Miss Clark, Jin-Seok replied, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Not one that is safe. I am not playing this game, she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at his chest. I am a nursing student. I serve coffee. I don't belong in this fortress. Just because your mother decided to publicly lose her mind doesn't mean I lose my freedom. Jin-Seok's expression didn't shift, but the air around him grew heavier. He pulled a phone from his pocket and tapped the screen, turning it toward her. My mother's declaration was reckless, yes. But it was heard. On the screen was a live feed of her apartment building. Or what was left of it. The front door was kicked in, the windows shattered, police tape fluttering in the wind. The Cobras were there 20 minutes after we left, he said, the coldness in his tone at odds with the violence on the screen. They went to finish the job. They went to find the woman who intervened. Imani stared at the ruin of her life, her knees weakening. This is the blood debt, Imani, Jin-Seok said, stepping closer, closing the distance until he was the only thing she could see. You saved a life that was marked for death. Now, the mark is on you. You can hate this cage all you want, but step outside these gates, and you are a corpse. Imani sat on a silk cushion in the estate's glass-walled pavilion, her knees protesting the unfamiliar posture. Across the low table, Madame Yoon sat with a posture so rigid it looked painful, though her face was pale from the toxins that had nearly killed her just 48 hours ago. Imani reached for the teapot, her movements automatic, born of years of double shifts. She was a black waitress. Serving was muscle memory. She kept her head lowered, eyes on the cup, trying to disappear. Stop, Madame Yoon commanded. The word was soft but struck like a cane. Imani froze, the spout hovering over the cup. I'm sorry. I was just... You are pouring like a servant, the matriarch said, her eyes sharp. You're looking at the floor like you expect to be scolded. Is this the woman who defied a Korean mafia boss in the middle of the street? Imani set the pot down, her jaw tightening. I'm trying to be respectful. I'm a guest in your house.
A prisoner, really.
You are the future daughter-in-law of the Baek clan, Yoon corrected, picking up her own cup with trembling but deliberate hands. Even if it is a title born of necessity, you must wear it like armor, not a costume. If you walk with your head down, the wolves will tear your throat out before you reach the gate. I didn't ask for the title, Imani said, her voice rising. I didn't ask to be publicly claimed or dragged into this war. I just wanted you to keep breathing. Madame Yoon studied her for a long moment, then placed her hand on the table. It was a small, fragile thing, but Imani noticed the calluses on the fingertips and the faint, jagged scar running down the thumb. "Do you think I was born in silk?" Yoon asked quietly. "I was a fishmonger's daughter in Busan. I smelled of gut and brine every day until I was 20. When I married into this life, they looked at me the way they look at you, like I was dirt on a diamond." Imani looked at the older woman's hands, then at her own. Dry from sanitizer, scarred from hot plates and broken glass. "They see a black waitress who doesn't belong," Imani whispered, the insecurity she hid behind anger finally leaking out. "They see what you show them," Yoon countered. She reached across the table, covering Imani's hand. "You fought death for a stranger. That is not the act of a servant. That is the act of a queen. Start acting like one." Imani looked up, meeting the Iron Lotus's gaze. For the first time since the chaos, she didn't feel like a victim of the dying woman's decree. She felt a spark of recognition. "Now," Yoon gestured to the tea. "Pour again. But this time, do not bow your head." The estate was tomb quiet, the kind of heavy silence that usually preceded a storm. Imani couldn't sleep. The silk sheets felt like they were sliding off her skin, and the memory of the dying woman's gasp still echoed in the dark. She wandered down to the kitchen for water, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She smelled the iron tang of blood before she saw him. Baek Jin-Seok sat at the kitchen island, his suit jacket discarded on the floor. The white dress shirt was ruined, soaked through with crimson at the shoulder. He was trying to wrap a bandage around his upper arm one-handed, his teeth gritted in silent exertion. The invincible Korean Mafia boss looked human for the first time since he'd abducted her. "You're doing it wrong," Imani said, stepping into the light. Jin-Seok flinched, his hand dropping to the gun on the counter before he recognized her. "Go back to bed, Miss Clark. And let you bleed on the imported tile?" Imani grabbed the first aid kit she'd spotted earlier, much better stocked than the one at the diner where she'd been just a black waitress 3 days ago. "Sit still." "I said leave it," he growled, but he didn't stop her when she peeled the soaked fabric away from his skin. It was a knife wound, deep, jagged, and angry. Imani's nursing training kicked in, pushing aside her fear of the man attached to the injury. She cleaned the wound with efficient, steady hands. Jin-Seok watched her, his breathing controlled, his eyes tracking the furrow of her brow. "You have a light touch," he murmured, the aggression bleeding out of his voice along with the adrenaline. "I have steady hands," she corrected, threading a suture needle. "You're lucky. An inch lower, and you'd have lost motor function." "Luck seems to be following me lately," he said, his gaze intense. "First my mother, now me. You make a habit of saving people who don't deserve it. Everyone deserves to breathe, Jin-Seok. Even you." She leaned in to stitch the wound, her face inches from his. He could smell soap and sleep on her skin. For days, he had viewed her as a liability, a walking target painted by his mother's reckless publicly declared wish. A future daughter-in-law, who didn't know the rules of war. But as the needle pierced his skin and she didn't flinch at his pain, the calculation in his mind shifted. She wasn't just a piece on the board. She was the only thing in this house that wasn't trying to take something from him. Imani tied off the final stitch and snipped the thread. She looked up, expecting to see the cold warlord. Instead, she found him watching her with a raw, dark hunger that made the air in the kitchen suddenly thin. "Done?" she whispered, her pulse jumping in her throat. "Not yet," he said softly. He didn't move away. For a terrifying, electric moment, the space between them wasn't a cage. It was a sanctuary, and neither of them wanted to leave it. The warmth of the kitchen evaporated with the rising sun. By noon, the estate felt less like a sanctuary and more like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided in secret. Imani walked the perimeter of the garden, pretending to admire the koi pond, but her ears were tuned to the static of the guards' radios and the hushed conversations that died the moment she approached. The title of future daughter-in-law, which Madame Yoon had bestowed so publicly, was no longer a shield. It was curdling into something toxic. "She's a plant," a voice hissed from behind a wall of jasmine. Imani froze, crouching behind a stone lantern. Think about it. A black waitress just happens to be on that specific corner? Just happens to have medical training? The cobra sent her to finish what the toxin started. Imani's breath hitched. It was Lieutenant Kong, the second in command, who watched Jin-Seok with cold, hungry ambition. The boss is blind because she touched him. Another voice replied, low and sneering. He's letting a spy sleep in the master wing while we bleed in the streets. If she tries anything, I don't care what the old woman said. I'll put her down. The accusation stung worse than the fear. They didn't see the woman who had stopped a dying matriarch's heart from failing. They saw a Trojan horse. The intimacy she had shared with the Korean Mafia boss mother the night before, the vulnerability of his unbuttoned shirt and the trust in his dark eyes, suddenly felt like a trap. If his men believed she was a spy, Jin-Seok couldn't protect her without starting a civil war within his own ranks. She wasn't a queen in training. She was a loose end. Imani backed away slowly, her sneakers silent on the stone path. The air felt thin, suffocating. She couldn't stay here waiting for a bullet in the back from the very men supposed to guard her. She needed to leave.
Now.
Before the whispers turned into knives. She hurried back to the suite, not to pack. That would take too long, but to grab the service key card she'd swiped from a maid's cart earlier that morning. Her hands shook as she pulled on a dark hoodie, hiding her face. She wasn't waiting for Jin-Seok to save her again. She was saving herself. Pulse thundering against her ribs like a trapped bird, Imani slipped out the service entrance, trading the gilded cage for the deadly uncertainty of the open street. She made it to the perimeter wall, the service gate looming ahead, but as she swiped the card, the light didn't turn green. It flashed red. And then the alarms began to scream. The siren wailed like a physical blow, vibrating in Imani's teeth. She jammed the key card against the reader again, but the red light only mocked her. The heavy iron gates remained shut, sealing the Black Waitress inside a world that had decided to reject her. Headlights swept over her, blinding and white. Tires screeched against the gravel, and before she could scramble into the shadows, a black sedan drifted sideways, cutting off her escape. Baek Jin-Seok stepped out into the chaotic strobe of the security lights. He didn't look like a man concerned with a prisoner escaping. He looked like a man watching his life bleed out. Open the gate. Imani screamed over the alarm, her hood falling back. Let me go before your men put a bullet in me. Jin-Seok raised a hand, and the deafening siren cut out instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. He signaled to the armed guards rushing from the perimeter shadows. Leave us. The command was silent, absolute. The soldiers hesitated, glaring at the woman they believed was a spy, but they retreated into the dark. You heard them, Imani said, her voice shaking as she backed against the cold iron bars. They think I'm a plant. They think I finished the job the dying woman started. I can't stay here, Jin-Seok. If you leave, you die, he said, walking toward her. He wasn't storming. He was stalking, but without the threat of violence. I'll take my chances, she snapped. I was invisible before your mother publicly branded me. I can be invisible again. No, you can't. He stopped inches from her, boxing her in against the gate. The world has seen you now. And more importantly, I have seen you. I am a liability. Imani pushed against his chest, but he was immovable. I am a drag on your empire. I am a fake future daughter-in-law that your lieutenant wants dead. Why are you keeping me? Because the house is cold, he confessed. The words were so quiet she almost missed them. Imani froze, her hands still pressed against the lapels of the terrifying Korean Mafia boss. The stoic mask he wore like armor had cracked, revealing exhaustion so deep it looked like grief. What? She breathed. Before you walked into that kitchen and stitched me up, Jin-Seok said, his voice rough, this place was a mausoleum. It was just blood and business. I walked through these halls like a ghost. He reached up, his fingers brushing the stray curl at her temple, a touch so gentle it made her knees weak. You are the first thing in 10 years that has made this estate feel like something other than a graveyard. Jin-Seok, this is dangerous, she whispered, her resolve crumbling under his gaze. I know, he said, leaning his forehead against hers. I'm not asking you to stay for your safety anymore, Imani. I'm selfish. I'm asking you to stay for me. The Lunar New Year celebration was meant to be a renewal, painting the estate in auspicious red light. But as Imani smoothed the silk of the hanbok Madame Yoon had gifted her, the color felt less like a blessing and more like a premonition. She looked at her reflection in the darkened glass. She was no longer just the black waitress hiding in a hoodie. She was a woman standing at the center of a dynasty. Then the lanterns exploded. Gunfire shredded the delicate paper screens, turning the festive courtyard into a slaughterhouse. The music died, replaced by the wet thud of loyal guards falling. Through the smoke, Lieutenant Kong stepped over a body, his weapon raised, finally shedding his mask of loyalty. "You should have let nature take its course," Kong shouted over the ringing silence, his eyes manic. He trained his weapon not on Jin-Seok, but on the matriarch cowering near the dais. "The Iron Lotus is wilted. She should have stayed dying on that pavement." He fired. Jin-Seok moved with a roar, but he was too far. It was Imani who reacted. She shoved the older woman behind a heavy overturned table, the bullet splintering the wood inches from her ear. "Traitor." Madame Yoon spat, frail but furious. "I am saving the clan," Kong yelled, signaling his rogue faction to advance. "We were feared once. Now we bow to a future daughter-in-law who scrubs tables? You publicly humiliated us by bringing an outsider into the inner sanctum." Jin-Seok vaulted the table, landing beside Imani. He was out of ammunition, his serrated knife drawn, the terrifying Korean Mafia boss cornered in his own home. But he didn't look at Imani with fear or the need to shield her like a fragile object. He looked at her with partnership. "Can you move her to the safe room?" he asked, breathless, nodding to his mother. "Only if you clear a path," Imani replied, her hands shaking but her grip tight on a heavy ceramic vase she'd grabbed from the debris. "Together then," he said. For the first time, he didn't push her behind him. They stood back to back against the encroaching shadows. As the first assassin lunged, Jin-Seok parried with lethal grace, while Imani swung the vase with desperate precision, cracking it against the skull of a man trying to flank them. She wasn't a soldier, but she refused to be a victim. In the chaos of the Red Night, the hierarchy collapsed. There was no boss, no servant, only two people fighting to keep the darkness from winning. The gunpowder smoke clung to the courtyard like a shroud, masking the scent of the blood spilled on the ancient stones. The coup was broken. The traitor Kong was dragged away, his screams fading into the night, leaving only the dying embers of the rebellion and the heavy, terrified silence of the survivors. Imani leaned against a scorched pillar, her legs trembling, not from fear, but from the crash of adrenaline. She raised a hand to her cheek, wincing as her fingers grazed the swelling purple bruise where the vase's recoil had struck her. In the reflection of a shattered window, she didn't recognize herself. The black waitress who worried about tips and tuition seemed a lifetime away. The woman staring back had ash in her hair and a fierceness in her eyes that belonged to this brutal world. Across the courtyard, Baek Jin-Seok was issuing orders, his voice a low, lethal rumble that commanded absolute obedience. His remaining lieutenants surrounded him, awaiting instruction on how to secure the perimeter. But then he stopped mid-sentence. His gaze locked onto Imani. He broke the circle of his men, walking away from the strategic discussion without a backward glance. The Korean Mafia boss crossed the debris-strewn floor, ignoring the confusion of his soldiers. When he reached Imani, the air seemed to leave the room. "You're hurt," he said, his voice stripped of its command, leaving only raw concern. "It's just a bruise, Jin-Seok," she whispered, trying to turn her face away. "Go back to your men. They need to see you strong." "They need to see what matters," he corrected. And then he did the unthinkable. In front of the army he commanded, men raised to view weakness as a death sentence. Jin-Seok dropped to one knee. He didn't care about the mud ruining his trousers or the optics of bowing before the outsider. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a pristine handkerchief, and gently dabbed the soot from her cheek. A collective gasp rippled through the watching guards. He was publicly lowering himself, physically and symbolically, to tend to her. "Hold still," he murmured, his thumb brushing the tender skin with agonizing tenderness. I need to check for a fracture. Jin-Seok, they're watching, Imani breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. They're confused. Let them be confused, he replied, his eyes searching hers. My mother named you the future daughter-in-law to save the bloodline. But tonight you fought for it. You bled for it. He didn't rise. He stayed kneeling, forcing every hardened criminal in the courtyard to look at the woman standing above him. It was a silent decree, louder than any shout. She is not a guest. She is not a prisoner. She is the priority. You are not a liability, Imani, he whispered, pressing the cloth to her cheek. You are the only reason we are still standing. 6 months had turned the blood-stained snow of the estate into a lush, sprawling garden of cherry blossoms. The air no longer smelled of gunpowder and fear, it smelled of renewal. Imani Clark stood on the balcony of the newly inaugurated Yoon-Seo-kyung Medical Wing, a charity clinic funded entirely by the syndicate's cleaner revenue streams. She fingered the pin on her lapel, a simple silver caduceus, marking her graduation from nursing school. She was no longer just the black waitress who had stumbled into a war. She was a woman who had helped end one. Below her, the garden party was in full swing. Madame Yoon, fully recovered and more formidable than ever, was holding court. She looked up, catching Imani's eye, and offered a rare, genuine smile, a far cry from the dying woman grasping for life on the asphalt. You look like you're analyzing the crowd for threats, a deep voice rumbled beside her. Imani turned to see Baek Jin-Seok. He wasn't wearing his usual armor of black tactical suits. He wore a softened navy blazer, looking less like a Korean mafia boss and more like the man she had learned to know in the quiet hours of the night. Old habits, Imani teased softly. I'm still checking for exits. You don't need them anymore, Jin-Seok said, moving closer until his arm brushed hers. The exits are closed. Not because you're a prisoner, but because you built a home here. He turned her gently to face him, his expression serious. The playfulness vanished, replaced by the intensity that had once terrified her. When my mother named you her future daughter-in-law, it was a desperate decree to save the bloodline, he said, his voice steady. It was a political move made publicly to force my hand. I resented it. I resented you. And now? Imani asked, her breath catching. Now, Jin-Seok said, reaching into his pocket. I realized she wasn't issuing a command. She was reading a prophecy. He pulled out a small velvet box. Inside sat a ring of hammered gold and jade, ancient, heavy, and priceless. It wasn't a diamond meant to show off wealth. It was an heirloom meant to signify legacy. This belonged to my grandmother, he said. It is only worn by the woman who holds the heart of this family. I am not asking you to marry the boss of a syndicate, Imani. I am asking you to marry the man you saved from becoming a monster. Imani looked at the ring, then at the man who had knelt in the mud for her, who had bled for her, who had rewritten the rules of his violent world to make space for her light. I told you once I didn't want a golden cage, she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. Then let's build a kingdom instead, he replied. Imani smiled, extending her hand, not as a savior, not as a servant, but as an equal. Yes. As he slid the ring onto her finger, fulfilling the destiny that began with a stopped heart on a city street, the title of daughter-in-law was no longer a burden. It was a coronation. Now that the waitress has become the queen and the golden cage has turned into a kingdom, do you think their war is truly over? Or are you ready to subscribe for the continuation of more dark romance stories like this, where the only thing more dangerous than the mafia is the woman who brings him to his knees?